Hi, everybody. My name is Caroline Barlerin, and I'm delighted to be joined by my fellow panelists today. Um, Today is really around being seen and heard and included, which has been technically challenging for the past 20 minutes. So apologies for those who were trying to get in and couldn't. Respect, comfort, and belonging. These are all feelings we want and wish for ourselves, our family, friends, colleagues, and our personal and professional lives. Our panel today is about creating inclusive workplaces, which is a challenging enough topic, but compounded with COVID-19 and the virus of racism out in the world, today's topic is extremely difficult to discuss, and yet it's critical we do. When COVID-19, the pandemic, ricocheted across the world, it upended our societies and brought our lives and work to a standstill. But today in the US, we wake up in a country where it is clear that not everything stood still. Racism has not stood still, bigotry has not stood still. And the fatal disparity that people of color face, whether at the hands of law enforcement or the whims of the healthcare system, has not stood still. While now is a time to take a stand or take a knee, while it is time for grief and anger, it is also time for reflection, action, and resolve, starting by kicking off our panel discussion. I'm delighted to be joined by three phenomenal speakers. Right now we have two of our phenomenal speakers. Meredith is going to be joining shortly to talk about ensuring inclusiveness and culture within workplaces and make sure that it goes beyond just affinity groups, or diverse pictures in a brochure. Today, we are going to talk about what makes inclusiveness real and concrete within our workplaces and beyond. So I'd like to invite each panelist to introduce themselves and share one piece of advice for leaders on creating space for people, given the events of this past week and in the midst of COVID. And Oris, I'd like to start with you. So Oris, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Well, thank
Welcome.
you, Caroline, and good afternoon, good morning to everyone. I'm Oris Stuart. I'm the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer for the National Basketball Association. I lead all of our diversity and inclusion efforts and strategies, and in our business and with our game, inclusion is central to everything we do. And as a word of advice, particularly in these challenging and perilous times, I would say, number one, understand where you are as an individual, as a leader around this topic. Really come to terms with how you are feeling, how you're dealing. Number two, get in touch with your people. Have those one-on-one conversations and those team conversations after understanding where you are. And then don't feel compelled to have an answer for everything. Giving people a chance to express themselves is an opportunity for you to learn, for you to build deeper relationships, for you to hear, and then over time respond more thoughtfully with that context. Thank you, Caroline.
Oris, thank you. Thank you for that advice. And I would like to turn it over now to Idalia to introduce herself and share a word of advice for leaders.
Thank you. So my name is Idalia Hill. I actually lead strategy and operations for a coalition called CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion. It is the largest kind of CEO-led business coalition toward advancing DEI within the workplace. I love, and I almost want to build off on what Oris said. I feel like step one is to acknowledge and be aware of where you are as a leader. And I would almost kind of say, as a step two to that, acknowledge that this is happening, that there's something going on, give people the opportunity to kind of be able to discuss and acknowledge what is happening. I was recently on the phone with a signatory who put out a statement on Friday, as many CEOs, I'm sure many of you have seen, are recently doing. And they were incredibly proud of themselves because they said this was the first time their CEO was willing to acknowledge what was going on in the outside world. And that was because for them, they'd always taken the stand of, we can't influence or change what goes on outside of our four walls. And so I would actually challenge that and say, like, acknowledgement is that first step. And hopefully by acknowledging it and giving people the opportunity to discuss it and face that conversation, there is actually the opportunity to change what happens outside of your four walls.
Nelia, thank you very much for sharing that, and enjoyed what your colleague on the main stage was talking about corporate purpose earlier, and that tone from the top is so critical for leaders. Meredith, delighted to turn it over to you. I know that building inclusive communities is a real focus area for Dow, and so it'd be great for you to introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Wonderful to be here. Sorry for the little bit of tech trouble, but I'm in. I've been at Dow now for over 10 years, and for about the last 5 years, I've been running all the work that we do around the world around cultivating the next generation of innovators in the STEM space, particularly in around chemistry, engineering, and manufacturing jobs, because that's what we need the most at our company. But I also lead our work around building inclusive communities. And we believe that inclusion drives innovation. And in order to be inclusive, it has to kind of move out from your four walls and into communities where people feel like they can bring their whole selves to work and school and anywhere in the community. In terms of the piece of advice, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about this, and I'm just speaking for myself personally. I've spoken to a number of loved ones and a number of people I love in my life who are Black about how they're feeling. And, I think we're all really frustrated and upset and angered and saddened by what's going on. But I realize that oftentimes these conversations take place after a crisis hits. And that's when we get upset and, people are really enraged and something has to change. And then, another name is added to the list of someone who is lost. And what sort of an eye-opener for me is that I want to challenge myself to start to really have these conversations about not just the big things that are all over the news, but the small things that African Americans in this country have gone through and go through in their everyday life that me, being a white woman, I don't notice and I don't experience. And so that's something that I'm really committing myself to doing a lot more of. And I'm hoping that, as a community overall and as a species, we can start to support each other in that way.
Meredith, thank you for those remarks. I do think that the experience of multiple realities in the workplace and in the world has been something that's been true for a very, very long time. And with privilege of deciding, what you can choose to opt into or not versus reality that you can't. Some of the places I've worked at, when you say, do you think you'll be able to get ahead here? If you cross-reference that based off of many different intersections, different people feel as though they can get ahead in different ways, because some just assume it's a meritocracy because they know the rule book, and others know it's not a meritocracy because they know that there's unspoken rules that are never in any rule book. I'd love to hear from you all about some of the most out-of-the-box strategies that you've seen work on inclusion, and what you feel like has made those strategies successful.
Was that directed to me, or was it directed
to all of you? So Meredith, you want to chime in, and then
I'm sure I can start. So our ambition of our company is to be the most customer-centric, sustainable, innovative, and inclusive company in the world. And I think that part of what's been interesting for us is the realization that inclusion and inclusion work should not be in a silo. It should be connected to all the different parts of your organization inside and out. And I also think that in terms of the community, because I'm speaking from that standpoint, it's really about truly listening to what the greatest need is around inclusion and adjusting your strategy to meet that need. And so I'll give an example. One of the pillars that I work on is around helping to drive inclusion within schools. And the way that we came to that space was we were having some challenges in our hometown of Midland, Michigan, which is a couple hours north of Detroit. And it was specifically around inclusion, but race. And so we pulled a group together across sector and business and nonprofit and education to have a discussion about truly what the issues were. And what it came down to is one of the biggest issues was really the fact that young people were coming to school not feeling included and feeling discriminated against. And how, if that's happening in our schools, are we going to actually have an inclusive community? So we worked together to pull together a task force that's now been working for a few years on creating policies, procedures, having courageous conversations about inclusion. That then moved a couple of last year to us taking that globally. So we started similar cohorts in Johannesburg in South Africa, outside of one of our sites in Argentina, as well as Louisiana and in Michigan, continuing in Michigan. Very, different layers of what inclusion looks like, whether it's race or gender or sexual orientation in different locations. But one thing that emerged from that was that mental health for both students and teachers was a challenge across all these different locations. And so we started having that group work together on that. And I've gotten a lot of questions of, DAO and mental health. Like, you guys, STEM makes sense for schools. Why are you doing this? Like, this doesn't really seem to be in your wheelhouse. And I think, the answer to that is that if our ambition truly is to be this top innovating company, students aren't going to be able to grow up to be the next chemists, engineers, manufacturers that solve these global challenges if they don't feel comfortable in their own skin in school. They're not going to be able to learn effectively, and they're not going to be able to be successful as they can be. So I think in that space, I'm really proud of the way that we've connected it back into our core business mission. We've taken it global. We found ways to engage employees, and we've, thought outside of the box of what we would typically think about doing when it comes to education.
Great, Meredith. Oris, other thoughts from you?
Yeah, sure. So I would say we have at the League done what so many organizations who are focused on this topic have done. We had a conversation around unconscious or implicit bias. We had it at every level of our League. We had it globally, and we had a very meaningful conversation. We decided that wasn't enough because creating the awareness created this unfreezing situation, this aha moment, but it wasn't sufficient to really drive people to change behaviors or even guide people to change behaviors. And so that conversation we established was called conscious inclusion. But we decided we needed to create another experience, and we called it everyday inclusion. And in that experience, we looked at what are the interactions, formal and informal, that happen every day between colleagues, employee to employee, leader to department, again, formal and informal. We cataloged what those situations were, and we identified how bias shows up and what we as individuals can do, regardless of our station in the organization, to interrupt that bias. And so we had a conversation called everyday inclusion, and we really spelled out and laid out what the expectations are going to be for all of us to create a more inclusive culture. And so now, beyond just this awareness of this power of unconscious bias and concerns around it, we actually provided expectations around behavior. We thought that wasn't enough, though. And so we actually extended that conversation and created an experience called practicing inclusion. And so layered and layered just to make sure we were continuing to drive home this idea that each of us has a responsibility for creating a more inclusive environment, and for us to think inclusively to the point where we build an instinct for inclusion, an inclusive instinct, versus what so often we have, a diversity reflex. And so that's really how we have approached this. Let's shift from having a diversity reflex to an inclusion instinct, and let's think about it every day in everything we do. And so I don't know how innovative that is or out of the box, but ultimately that's how we frame this conversation. Lead with inclusion and have diversity as an outcome. And we still are on that journey, but I feel good about at least the conversation.
Idalia, I'd love to turn it over to you to share and reflect thoughts on this.
Yeah, thank you. It's funny because I was actually, Oris, I appreciate you saying, like, I don't know how out of the box. It's interesting. I think when you're trying to define out of the box, there's a little bit of everybody is doing something that's a little out of the box for them in a way, because they're taking these core things and adding their flavor to it or their twist to it. And so maybe not so much an observation of exact out of the box strategies, but more just a reflection on what I see a lot of organizations doing in terms of the approach, which is a wonderful thing of kind of putting aside that mindset of kind of like an expert mindset and coming in and knowing what the issue is. I'm seeing a lot of organizations kind of shift and take that beginner's mind, where they're really kind of not going into the situation assuming they know what the root cause of the issue, just like Meredith was talking about. Well, how does that connect? That's an interesting place for you to be. Well, let me explain how we got there, right? There's an actual reason and a connection point to the things that people are pursuing. And so I think it's across the board an interesting observation to see people take more of that beginner's mindset and acknowledge going into it, they actually need to just take a step back and do the listening tours, observe what's going on, and try to get to the root of it, instead of coming in and saying, I know exactly how to fix this issue. Well, let me just pull this program together and deploy it, and it will magically work.
Yeah, I think it's definitely such a wild time to be having this conversation. In the 60s, you know, we got home, we all watched the same news. And so we shared a commonality of experience of witnessing things. And now we are all in our own filter bubbles, if you will, thanks to social media, places that I formerly have worked. But I think, you know, before 9/11, talking about politics or talking about religion, talking about these issues, identity in the workplace was kind of a taboo thing. We kind of kept that out of the workplace, and we checked our personal identity at the door, and we went in and we were good workers, and we came out. And I think that has definitely evolved. I'd love, Idalia, to start with you about hearing about kind of how you think, what are the roles and responsibilities for companies or organizations to have in helping change social injustice, particularly around race in the US and this COVID pandemic. Just kind of, it seems like companies are now more than ever taking a stand or standing up in a whole new way than we've ever heard before.
Yeah, well, and I'll go back to almost that kind of, and it's on my mind because the conversation was just yesterday, to have an organization say, I can't control the outside world, so I've never really put a statement out there. And that might have been the case when, let's even say, something as recent as Ferguson happened. But today, like, there's just been such a shift, right? Like we've little by little seen these steps. And I think now people, and I'll say we launched CEO Action in 2017. I think a lot of the messaging and conversation, people were recognizing that there was an opportunity, right? And that's kind of what you hung on. And I think now, over the past 3 years, and you look at the history of what certain people are growing up watching and seeing over and over and over again, there's now like a very strong sense of it's no longer an opportunity, it's an obligation. And I think a lot of these CEOs are like recognizing that they have a strong obligation to support not just the bottom line, but the broad array of stakeholders. And by doing that, they're actually supporting the overarching value and long-term trajectory of their business, right? So it makes sense, but I think that they are definitely all starting to recognize and step up, and it's amazing to see this shift in a way, in my opinion, of people moving from that notion of there's an opportunity here and I'm going to put my voice into it, to I have an obligation to use my influence and my position as a leader to influence change, and to recognize that, you know, having any type of reaction or outrage without an actual action attached to it and some type of push for something different is just not going to be worth the effort, right? It's not something that you can do anymore. Outrage without that action just isn't really worth it in a way.
And I just want to stay with you for a second. I'm just curious of going from opportunity to obligation for leaders. There's the priorities for leaders and the, if you will, the economy of attention of what's being asked of them is higher. And it's just a lot of coming at people. What do you think? Is that going to push or pull this topic to center or to the sidelines, or does it really depend on the leader?
I mean, I'd love to hear from Meredith and Oris. I think that it also really depends on the leader, which I think is almost like a sad in a way, because I think that when you look at everything, as people are reimagining, and I think I mentioned this too, like as people are reimagining the business landscape, they're examining every facet of the business, and this is no different. This is also a facet of the business that needs to be examined and reimagined and evolved post-COVID, the same way any other element would be. And I think that, you know, those that are unfortunately letting it be tabled, you know, are not in as good of a place, or will be seen as well as those that are actually keeping it front and center and maintaining the focus on it and acknowledging that it does have a strong place within their business.
Whereas I feel like the NBA is exemplar in allowing people to share their voice and share their thoughts, and people to have the courageous conversations in person and in public. I'd love to hear your thoughts on building off this topic.
Well, I think the way you framed it it's profound. This idea of going from opportunity to responsibility. Let's be clear: our employees, our fans, the market, our community. Here's an expectation that you have a point of view on what's affecting them. And if you choose to remain silent, that's a statement in itself. And so what I think has happened in the current environment is, one can no longer stay silent because of the statement that makes to employees, in our case, to fans and so on. But however, we see ourselves as certainly a professional basketball league, but we also see ourselves as having a role in a broader culture. Certainly our players, because of their followership, because of their relationship with their fans, have an important role to play. And so we encourage them to, number one, be informed of those issues that are central to them or that they care about. And with that education and that information, to feel free to express themselves. And we are going to continue to support them in that regard. I would also say we have evolved and matured in terms of our ability to have those tough conversations internally, which allows us to really be more thoughtful externally. And that's not something that every organization can get to naturally, but I'm happy and I'm proud that I work at an organization where, when events happen externally, we can convene and share with each other and hear from each other and understand that whether we talk about it or not, these issues are here. We're working with people who are dealing with something. And if we don't address it, then, we're not really in a position where we can get the most out of each other. It's going to be a burden. It's going to get in the way. It's going to sap our capacity. And so to be able to have those conversations internally unleashes capacity and, quite frankly, informs how we engage externally. I mean, I make it sound like it's straightforward and it's easy. It's something that I think we continue to work on. And I just, appreciate that, we're in a place where we're trying to get better every day.
That's great, Oris. Thank you. And thank you everyone who's introducing themselves in the chat. And Meredith, there's a question in the Q&A on what do you do if your company hasn't had these conversations around race and diversity and inclusion, but you just started and you don't know, you don't want to step on toes? And this is an anonymous attendee asking this question. So even the attendees trying to figure out how to ask it without sharing what company they just started at that's not having these courageous conversations yet.
Right.
Do you have thinking from Dow on kind of how you've done it or advice for somebody who doesn't want to step on toes but eager to have these conversations?
Sure. And I would say that, I think, so from a personal perspective, and then I'll move to the company, I believe in the power of positive intention. And I think there are times when dipping your toe in the water, starting to have that conversation makes you nervous, and you're worried about saying the wrong thing. But change is uncomfortable. When we see changes in the world, they're not always done perfectly gracefully. And so I think don't let, number one, from a personal perspective, that deter you from opening up those conversations. I'd say from a company side, Dow has been, I'm so proud of how Dow has been a real leader in the inclusion space across different dimensions of diversity for many decades. But that still does not mean that we have all of the answers or that we've, quote, tackled it or solved it, because this is an evolving issue. I think a lot of it starts at the top. We've been very fortunate to be led by a series of executives who committed themselves to this in their personal and professional life. Our CEO, Jim Fitterling, put out a statement a couple of days ago about these race issues, and it was very, very powerful. And one of the things that stood out to me that he said, is that I do this, I'm doing this as a leader, but more importantly, I'm doing this as a human being. And at the end of the day, companies are made up of a set of individuals. And, having that leadership at the top really helps to drive that. The other thing I would say too, though, is that, there's the grassroots piece of it. How are you, whether it's through employee resource groups or whether it's through, we've really found powerful is to be volunteering. On an individual basis, a lot of people are asking themselves, like, what can I do to help to create change? How do I solve this? What do I do? And so I think starting to create mechanisms that can get employees connected to things that they're passionate about, out in their community volunteering, connecting with each other. And I think starting to create the framework for that action opens up opportunities to have these conversations.
Great. Meredith, thank you. Again, thanks to everyone who's sharing information in the chat and the Q&A. We're going to try to get to many of these, but we may not get to all of them, especially with due to the late start and not wanting the next session to go late. But Idalia, there's a question here about just where you see trends of the demand of inclusivity being reflected in hiring. So there's the attract, you develop, retain, but with leaders in an organization, and kind of how, if you're screening for a leader, kind of how they think about inclusivity, how they think about diversity, inclusion, equity, you know, how when you're hiring leaders in your organization, how you think about that. And then Oris, would love to hear from you.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because I actually want to build really quickly on that. Meredith made amazing points, and also just wanted to kind of add this notion of part of, you know, being courageous and having these conversations and working every day to have the dialogue is also working every day to dispel the myth of kind of like the fear of making a mistake or receiving correction. Sometimes people don't really want to do it because they don't want to make the mistake, or if someone corrects them, they fear they've totally made the wrong move or said the wrong thing, and now, you know, all bets are off. And it's kind of the acknowledgement of it's okay, the same way that we grew up being like, it's okay to make mistakes and not totally get something right the first time around. It's a big part of, you know, being courageous enough to have these discussions. It's interesting. I mean, I'm trying to think of what I hear across the board from various coalition organizations. I think across the board, I mean, they're paying a ton of attention to that, right? Like there is this kind of huge acknowledgement. Yes, we know, you know, from the bottom, I would say up, it's not just about bringing in and retaining and recruiting diverse talent, like at this level, it's at every single level. And we've seen more and more that it goes up to the board level. You know, how are you making sure that that is catching up to where the world should be as well? And then the one thing that I think is interesting in there, and it goes to, because a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, I think at the root, some of it is behavioral cultural change, right? And so we're seeing a lot of work toward what I'll just largely bucket as inclusive leadership in a way, and just making sure that that is a very big component of how you're developing people. And so that way it kind of maybe filters into those that get the opportunity now to kind of come in the door. But I'll talk because I see some head shaking too, so.
Yeah, I would say heads nodding. Very much. Yeah, absolutely. One of your earlier comments, and then respond directly to your leadership question. I really believe that there are two supporting things that need to happen. I've already mentioned this idea of assuming positive intent, right? And creating space for someone to go there and to make a mistake and to kind of lean into a conversation. You know, on the other side of that, and what makes us more able and better able to assume positive intent is building more familiarity, comfort, and trust, right? Mm-hmm. Knowing each other and treating not each other as we want to be treated, but treating each other as they want to be treated. How do you get there? Get to know people. And so, and Meredith, you talked about one relationship at a time, and a lot of this is about one relationship at a time that really creates the, you know, this exponential impact. So I really do think we're on something certainly all aligned here. From a leadership standpoint, you know, the thing that we have also focused on, in addition to what I shared around the impact of bias and interrupting and breaking through that bias, the idea that in an organization, individuals are experiencing the organization in different ways. Some people, particularly those that fit more neatly into the prevailing corporate culture, when they show up every day, they've got a tailwind. They walk in the door, they go through the revolving door, and there's a tailwind. It's carrying them to the elevator, carrying them up to their desk, and behind them, advancing them every day. And for others, particularly those who are different, however you define different from the prevailing culture, they got a headwind. Often they have a headwind. And it can be exhausting for some of us, showing up every day and working against that headwind. And so we need to understand and unpack what are those tailwinds that are helping some and headwinds that are getting in the way of others, and then address those issues, address the issues that the company can address systemically, address the issues that the manager or leader needs to handle with his or her individual employees. And then let's not let the employee out of the responsibility category too. We have a responsibility understanding our place in the organization and being effective in our own right. So on all three levels, we've got to understand what's getting in the way and then create responsibility for leaders to remove barriers and create tailwinds where there are headwinds, and for individuals to understand, their role. And so that's conceptual, but the exercise that I described earlier, take those concepts and put them into practice on everyday activities, doing performance evaluations, having career conversations, giving feedback on projects, assembling project teams to be more innovative, and so on and so on. So, there's a lot here. You just gotta, understand what's getting in the way and start to weave it into your everyday.
Yeah, and Carolyn, I just saw a pop-up about kind of, I don't know if it was a clarification on this question about but meaningful questions that you're asking. And I just wanted to say, I think that there are those meaningful questions. It's going to be different in every single organization at every single level, because it kind of builds on what Oris is saying. There's a different experience, and at every single level, people almost have a different opportunity and responsibility in this journey, right? So maybe the associate or junior level person down here needs to be aware or thinking about these types of things. Maybe the manager up here needs to be asking these types of questions and considering these types of decisions, and maybe the most senior executives are thinking about it also from a different way. But so there are those meaningful questions. I think they're going to change based upon the spectrum in terms of where an employee is and their ability to have impact and drive the conversation and drive change. And that's maybe why I kind of looked at something which is broad, admittedly, but that notion of inclusive leadership, and it kind of goes to what Oris is saying around that idea of starting to truly acknowledge that there is a different experience being had, and hopefully by acknowledging that, there's a way to work to solve against or address.
Something I want to add on that a little bit too is I think one of the bright spots of what has been a very challenging time with the virus is I feel that people have gotten a lot more real with each other. You're not putting on your suit and, making sure you're, standing up tall and presence in meetings and not talking about what's going on in your family. I've learned more about colleagues and how they feel about different things and what they're experiencing, home situations in the last couple of months, and had more honest conversations with people than I have in a long time. And I hope that one of the aspects of this virus is that we're opening up ourselves a little bit more to that community of learning who it is that we work with and how we can co-support each other. And so while it has been a really challenging time, I'm hoping that as we get on the other side of this, our approach to each other and the way we treat each other is different.
This conversation deserves its own conference. This conversation deserves its own 3 days and its own, work. And I really appreciate this concept of work in progress. And Oris, the concept of the headwinds and tailwinds just so beautifully articulates that reality of the imposter syndrome or the tax that people have of being worried about, are they going to do the right thing or say the right thing, and understanding the power and privilege of people who don't even need to consider that just because they're welcome and they're comfortable and they're familiar. And so really breaking down those dynamics and having these tough conversations is important. I'd like just to end with maybe a hopeful, something you are hopeful for. There's a lot of darkness right now. There's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of challenges. Meredith, I think you build off of it when you were saying this kind of seeing each other in a whole new way. When people's spouses and children run in, or seeing people's bedrooms or kitchens or conversations at home, there is a different human connection. It'd be great to maybe end on a hopeful note from each of you. Meredith, I'll just start with
absolutely. So I think that what we're experiencing in the world is at least opening my eyes up to a sense of urgency around, I believe in my heart that humanity on a number of levels is going through a true evolution. And I am challenging myself to look and see, what are the tools that I have from, being blessed to be able to work at an organization like Dow that I can bring to bear. And so I think if all of us kind of looked and said, what are the resources we have to be able to do something? So for example, I was really fired up over the weekend about watching what I was seeing on TV, and I'm like, I want to do something. And it just popped into my mind of, I mentor a 10-year-old here in the city, and I started thinking about how she feels. She's African American, her family is, and I want to have that conversation with her. But I want to make sure that I'm prepared to have it, and the other mentors in my organization are prepared to have it in the most helpful way for her. And so I connected with the people at Dow who are unconscious bias trainers, and I was like, will you train the mentors at my organization? So we can, figure out how to be most helpful. And it got me thinking, in the past, we have these ideas that pop into our mind, but then the world kind of gets in the way and life gets in the way, and we let them slip by. And that for myself, I'm challenging myself, and for all of us, when we have those sparks of idea, action, we have resources we can use, like, let's just bring them to bear. Now is the time. I feel like, I'm excited to get to work. And I know there's other people that feel the same way. And I think if that's what we do, the world is going to be a very different place, and a better place.
Fantastic. Thank you, Meredith. Idalia?
Oh, geez, I was thinking about this. I mean, I want to say that I am hopeful over what I'm seeing in the sense of like a widespread acknowledgement. I think, you're really, for not the first time, but just a really large scale, seeing an abundance of acknowledgement and awareness across the board in terms of age or race or gender, and a push for some real action. And I think I'm inspired because I get the luxury of sitting at kind of the center of all of these different organizations start to take action and do things. And, it may be a little thing, but it's a huge step for them. And if everybody is taking these huge steps within their four walls, those things trickle out into the community. So I think I'm all kind of every single day inundated with emails from signatories that want resources for having conversations, for facilitating discussions, for doing all of these different things. But man, is that not an amazing kind of, thing to take in? And I'm like, if this is what's making me exhausted or kind of tired at the end of the day, great. I'll be tired every single day, because it's amazing to see that shift in people wanting to do more.
Wow. I'm hopeful. I am hopeful. Number one, I'm hopeful because, and I'm going to pick up on something you said, Meredith, this situation, the pandemic, before the unrest, has created a unique opportunity for us to see our colleagues in a different way. And one of the ways that happens is we see them in their homes. We see their daughter get up on their lap, and we get to meet their family. And so we are building more FCT, familiarity, confidence, trust, just because of the circumstance. So I'm hopeful that when we do get back and reconvene in an office setting, we'll have that experience to build on. But also, just really quickly, I know we're wrapping up here. I just thought, this is just last night, just popped in my head. I thought about Rosa Parks. I thought about the fact that when she decided or refused to give up her seat, she just didn't want to give up her seat. I mean, she wasn't, I don't think, at least, assuming she was going to spark this movement that was going to lead to the civil rights movement, if you will. Many people credit her with the birth of the civil rights movement. But she took a stand, and it created years of activation and activity that ultimately created some, I think, very, very meaningful outcomes. As I think about George Floyd's death, his murder, his killing, there were many people that died before him, right, under similar or related circumstances. But there's something about this situation at the time and the way it happened and circumstances that led to my hope, optimism that, in fact, this will be another movement of that scale that will take time, but ultimately will get us to a new reality. So that's what I can't help but be hopeful. Otherwise, it'd be hard to get up early. So that's where I am.
Thank you to all of the panelists. And I know there's a lot of wisdom and passion and commitment with the participants. And I'm sorry we weren't able to get to everyone's questions in chat, but I hope that we can continue the conversation today throughout the various forums, tomorrow and beyond, because we really need to have these tough conversations and these conversations together. The poet this morning, Charles Ray Patton, spoke about the need for the grit going forward in his response poem. and that we have not misplaced our backbone, but we will make courage contagious. And so I invite us all to go forward today and make courage contagious and have the tough conversations and have them with each other, recognizing we are a work in progress, and just keep going and crawl, walk, run, fly, soar, wherever we are, we keep moving forward. So onwards and upwards, everybody. Thank you. Have a beautiful rest of your day. Thank you. Take care.
Bye, everyone.